This is the story of PIA Flight 8303. On this day in 2020, a Pakistan International Airlines Airbus A320 was on its way from Karachi to The plane had been in service for just over 6 years at the time and had almost 9,000 cycles and 26,000 hours of flight time on it, so it was well within its technical life limits. The flight itself was pretty uneventful until the pilots started their descent into and somehow that instruction got garbled, and the pilots of Flight 8303 heard that transmission and thought that it was meant for them. So they decided to comply with the instruction that they did not receive and started to descend lower than they should have been. At 10:45 p.m., the plane reached its cruising altitude of 39,000 feet, and the pilots began the process of getting the plane ready for landing. So the pilot who was flying the plane put the engines into climb mode to stop the descent, and then he talked to us. It broke up in mid-air, and the debris rained down on the villages below. The first responders found 92 bodies at the scene, and many more seriously injured people. The Pakistani government immediately launched an investigation to find out what went wrong. They didn't respond to the low altitude alert. They didn't respond to any of it. The plane was approaching Islamabad, and the pilots were busy with the landing. They were going through the approach checklist, which is basically a list of things that need to be done before the plane lands. They were checking everything twice and thrice to make sure that they were good to land. But one of the items on the list required the pilots to set the autopilot's altitude to 10,000 feet. But this one was particularly egregious. These pilots made a small mistake at the beginning of the flight and then compounded that mistake by ignoring the instruments. They would have seen that the outside temperature was dropping lower than it should have been. They would have seen that they were in trouble. So he set the plane's altitude to 10,000 feet. But then the first officer realized his mistake and tried to correct it. He told the captain, "You have selected 10,000 feet, right?" The captain confirmed that he had, and then the first officer said, "Change it to 3,000 feet. But the captain didn't do that. Instead, he told the first officer to cancel the approach. He thought that the first officer was just trying to be funny. And if you want to watch more videos like this, stay tuned. He didn't realize that they were in trouble until it was too late, but they didn't take that moment. They were too busy playing a deadly game of telephone. They were so focused on completing the checklist that they never looked up to make sure that the plane was on track. But the pilots kept missing that step because they were so focused on the other steps. They had tunnel vision. The captain was yelling at the first officer, asking him why he set the altitude to 10,000 feet in the first place. But in this case, both pilots were equally inexperienced. Both pilots were just 23 years old, and neither of them had flown the Airbus A320 before. The captain had been on one training flight, and the first officer had never even been in a simulator. But the first officer was just as confused. He told the captain that he had never touched the altitude dial. They were too busy trying to follow the checklist that they forgot to use their common sense. They forgot to look up from the list and see if their plane was actually flying properly. Why? Well, the answer to that question can be found in the last conversation that the pilots had in the cockpit. After all, it's not like an airplane can only land if it has an altitude set on the autopilot. The plane was supposed to maintain that altitude until it was 1,000 feet above the ground, but the pilots were so busy with the checklist that they never noticed that the plane was descending. They had gotten so used to setting targets and checking them off the list that they never bothered to look at the instruments to make sure that the plane was maintaining its altitude. But these guys were idiots. They set the autopilot's altitude to 3,000 feet instead of 10,000 feet, which is what the checklist said. Checklists are supposed to remind pilots of the things that they need to do, but pilots should always use their own judgment to make sure that they're following the checklist correctly. In this case, the pilots made a mistake while reading the checklist, and then they compounded that mistake by not monitoring the instruments. But they didn't notice that. They were so focused on completing the checklist that they missed that critical detail. He told him to turn the heating function of the plane on to counteract the freezing temperatures. But before the co-pilot could respond, the plane hit the ground with a sickening crunch. Now that's not a very uncommon thing to happen in commercial aviation. It happens all the time. You see, whenever an aircraft climbs or descends through different altitudes, the outside temperature changes. They found the plane's flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder. And as they listened to the recordings, they heard the pilots talking in Urdu. They said things like pull up, and too low, too late. But most importantly, they also heard something else. They heard the sound of metal on metal, the sound of something scraping against the ground. That was the sound of the plane losing control and hitting the trees. As the plane raises higher and higher, the air gets thinner and colder, and as it descends, the air gets thicker and warmer. Well, after listening to the cockpit voice recorder over and over again, the investigators came to a chilling conclusion. They realized that there was silence in the cockpit. For almost 3 minutes, neither of the pilots said a word. They were completely silent as the plane descended into the mountains, and that silence was deadly. These changes in temperature can be quite extreme. In fact, when this Airbus A320 took off from Karachi, the outside temperature was 29 degrees Celsius, but about 40 minutes later, when it reached its cruising altitude, the outside temperature was a chilly -37 degrees Celsius. They turned on the autopilot system and set the plane's altitude to 3,000 feet, and then they got to work on checking the landing gear, flaps and other systems. Meanwhile, air traffic control was talking to another plane in the vicinity, telling them to climb to 4,000 feet to avoid some weather. But the crew were quickly distracted by a warning that popped up on their instruments. It said that the plane's outside temperature was too low. Now, modern commercial planes like this Airbus A320 are built to withstand these extreme temperatures, but they need to be carefully managed. You see, really cold temperatures can affect the performance of the engines, making them less efficient. If it gets too cold, the fuel can also solidify inside the pipes and filters. So what do pilots do in such cases? Well, they keep the engine's outside temperature above a minimum limit of -40 degrees Celsius. As soon as the pilots of Flight 8303 saw that warning pop up on their instruments, they immediately knew that they needed to do something. The Airbus A320 that was carrying 97 people had crashed into a wooded mountainous region. The investigators combed through the wreckage looking for clues, and they eventually found some. But why did the plane lose control? Why did it crash? Was it pilot error? Was it a mechanical failure? Was it a bird strike? The pilots failed to respond to the warnings that were given to them by the plane. They didn't respond to the stick shaker warning. It was like this. Now, normally, this wouldn't be a big deal. And to make matters worse, once they set the autopilot's altitude to 3,000 feet, they didn't monitor it. You know, in aviation, it's important to remember that checklists are there to help pilots, not hinder them. Pakistan has a long history of aviation disasters, and a lot of them can be traced back to pilot error. If they had done that, if they had just taken a moment to glance at the instruments, they would have seen that the plane was descending lower than it should have been. You see, when the pilots were setting the autopilot's altitude, the first officer said 3,000 feet, but the captain misunderstood him and thought that he said 10,000 feet. In the final moments of the flight, the pilots were arguing with each other. Now, normally, when something like this happens, the more experienced pilot takes control of the situation. But the biggest problem wasn't their lack of experience. Their biggest problem was their lack of judgment. In the end, their obsession with the checklist cost them their lives and the lives of 92 other people. What do you think? What would you have done differently? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. That's all for today. See you next time.